So it's a great pleasure, as I said, to introduce Gareth Jones today. He's come from New Zealand. He's Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the University of Otago, which is right at the bottom end of the southern island of New Zealand. But he's also a visiting fellow at St Edmund's College here, so in one respect he's on home turf. He's been Professor of Anatomy and Structural Biology in Otago since 1983, but he has a particular interest in bioethics, and he's written a lot of things both scientifically and from a Christian perspective on that. And in fact, in 2004, he was made a Companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit for his contributions to science and education. So he's very well qualified to speak today on this topic of human enhancement. Is it a threat or a promise? And of course, we're just in the early days of that, and so I think it's a really important issue for people to think about at this stage. So, Gareth, over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I must apologise for my voice. Having picked up an English cold, but it's getting towards the latter stages now. Now, as we all know, we live in a world that oscillates between pessimism and optimism. It's the pessimism of overwhelming disease and sorrow, and the optimism of an overweening ability to transcend our limitations. And medicine has traditionally been viewed as a means of coping as best we can with rampant disease, with controlling it where possible, and caring for the sick at all times and under all circumstances. Extreme optimism, ushering in utopian visions of a disease-free state, have traditionally been the province of philosophers and visionaries, unencumbered by the need, perhaps, to change the lives of real people. That now, though, is breaking down. That distinction is breaking down. The possibility of enhancing the lives of ordinary people through biomedical technology is taking on at least some semblance of scientific reality. Biomedical enhancement appears to be entering doctors' consulting rooms, and this has many people very worried. Is medicine shifting from its conventional role of making people well to making people better than well? Is it becoming a monster in its own right, in that it's posing a challenge to our most fundamental conceptions of human nature and of the human condition? Or is being better than well simply, well, better? A more direct concern emerges in the sporting arena, where enhancement has abounded for many years. Interestingly, though, it tends not to have been viewed in these terms. People tend not to have talked so much about enhancement within sport, although that probably is what's been happening. Pete Moore commences his book, Enhancing Me, by fantasizing along these lines. And he writes, "In 1984, I was fit. I was 22 and supposedly studying for a degree. But in reality, I spent much of my time training. For him then, winning was the key, and there was no honour in coming second. But he did too much, and he became ill. He reflects, what would I have done to have had an extra 10% stamina and an additional 5% of strength, an ability to absorb coursework while I slept, and to hold it in a database-like memory. And he fantasizes about purchasing a packet of pills that would have enabled him to work for 7 days without needing to sleep. But now he's in midlife, and he wonders what would be required to regain his ability to run, to push, and to lift." Obviously, that's fantasy, but it's hardly far removed from present reality. I just want you to consider two recent reports. The first one, again, quite a well-known one, students are risking their health by taking drugs to help them revise all night. Students are taking non-prescription Ritalin to stay awake and alert for longer. The drug, which when used correctly is prescribed to children who suffer from ADHD, stimulates the brain and increases its dopamine levels, a chemical, we are told in this report, which is associated with pleasure, movement, and attention. And the second report, as you will see, is from Nature News. A drug used to treat narcolepsy and often taken to increase alertness and improve cognitive performance may have the potential to become addictive. Brain imaging studies performed on 10 men before and after taking the drug, called Provigil or modafinil, it showed that it boosts levels of dopamine, which influences the brain's reward system. Drugs of abuse, from tobacco to heroin, also impact dopamine levels. I just quote those two without any comment. Now, this is what you may describe as everyday enhancement, with all its allure and potential dangers. Some writers, though, go very, very much further than this. And one doesn't have to look very far to encounter some exceedingly expansive scenarios. And I don't know how much you might buy into these. For instance, we are told, on the eve of the 22nd century, diabetes, Parkinson's disease, and AIDS will have been consigned to the past. Tissues and organs will be readily regenerated, and human immortality will beckon. Technologies utilizing stem cells, constructing artificial chromosomes, and creating perfect transplants will together have transformed our vision of human nature. And we're also told, in the neuroscience realm, one reads of cosmetic neurology, which I might say is a term which is getting quite commonly used these days. And also we are told of a world in which there will be artificial brain parts that will help people with Alzheimer's disease form new memories. Now, all this is very well. But I think it should make us ask whether we ourselves aren't enhanced when we compare ourselves with those who lived in our sort of society, say, 150 years ago. Our world now would have been totally beyond their comprehension. Our normality may well have been enhancement to our forebears, had they thought in those particular terms. And so, in a sense, we get to the crux of the matter. What is enhancement? Now, like many questions, it's a very easy one to ask. It's not a very easy one to answer, or at least not to answer with clear-cut, straightforward answers. The frequently encountered distinction is that between enhancement and therapy. And so while therapy, the sort of thing you get from your general practitioner's waiting room or your surgeon, whatever it might be, while that is directed towards restoring an ill person to health, enhancement generally has the connotation of improving, and I quote, human form of functioning beyond what is necessary to sustain or to restore good health. And another way of expressing the same sentiment is to view enhancement as an intervention that goes beyond the ends of medicine as they have traditionally been held. And so in these terms, medical need is confined to restoring impaired function. Now, any definition like this, though, is far from precise. After all, the enhancement possibilities are immense, from selecting embryos for specific genetic abnormalities at one extreme, through to attempts at endless extension of the lifespan at the other. The question is, what criteria are being employed for deciding the boundaries of normal function and human nature, and therefore the dimensions of both therapy and enhancement? Now, in the light of this, some people conclude that enhancement is actually impossible to define with any assurance. But the term does invoke a range of socially based values and perceptions that appear to change over time and between societies. It may simply signify an improvement of capacities. But if this is all, then many therapies are enhancements. And many of the improvements in health status and sporting performance over the years are also enhancements. As I've said, it can be argued that we are all enhanced compared to what we would have been like had we lived 100, 150, 200 years ago. The term may not be used, people may not generally use that term, but we have to consider what are the differences. And so to try and take us a little bit further, I want to dissect enhancement. Now, the goal of enhancement, whether related to mental performance or sporting performance, is that it enables people to perform at higher levels than they would otherwise have performed. Now, this may be for a short time or in the long term. Improvements in memory or awareness or in sporting prowess, they're all aimed at giving to these individuals the benefit of improved capacities, and in many cases, the benefit of competitive advantage over others. Before asking how we might respond to these possibilities, I just want to clarify what I see as the dimensions of the whole enhancement debate. And I want to divide enhancement into three categories. Now, obviously, these are arbitrary categories, and I don't pretend they're not. But I think they might begin to give us some idea of what we might be talking about in enhancement. Now, category 1 refers to the enhancement of a healthy person, let's call them H, so that they become what we might call super healthy, whatever that might mean. For instance, if we become speculative, what if we were able to protect against early onset Alzheimer's disease? And we could do this by some form of genetic manipulation of embryos. Would those individuals in adult life be healthy or super healthy? Would that be therapy or enhancement? Now, in a sense, they're not super healthy because they're vulnerable to most other diseases. They've only been protected against early onset Alzheimer's disease. They're far from illness-free, and they're not perfectly healthy. And so in one regard, though, they have been enhanced. And my inclination is to regard these forms of enhancement, though, as various forms of therapy, even if they are highly technological variants by current standards. Now, the point here is that individuals whom we would consider today to be perhaps super healthy may come to be classed as normal, healthy individuals in the future. And of course, changes like this are all around us. They're the sort of changes we all take for granted without thinking a second time about them. Consider the use of vaccines as prophylactics, or the widespread adoption of public health measures, provision of clean water supplies, let us say. Now, in many ways, those examples are utterly uninteresting, at least to us. And their enhancement effect on the health of whole populations, though, has been truly revolutionary. Along with dramatic increases in life expectancy and decreases in neonatal and childhood mortality, the concept of what constitutes good health has been transformed. And I'd suggest what we regard as good health is quite different from what people 100 years ago in this society would have considered good health. In other words, enhancement isn't simply a future phenomenon. It's already taken place in numerous societies. That's my category 1. Let's move on now to category 2. What I mean by this category is enhancement that may have nothing to do with health. For instance, the extension of abilities. And so in this case, enhancement encompasses those with what we might call, for the sake of argument, super abilities, as opposed to those with the normal range of abilities. So those with super abilities may be more intelligent than they would otherwise have been, or, perhaps more important than that, they can perhaps run faster. And so in this case, instead of correcting defects, normal functions will have been extended. Now, super abilities then may enable individuals to perform better than they would otherwise have performed. The sort of things, of course, that worries educational authorities and sports bodies, on account of its alleged unfairness, and I'll come back to that. Nevertheless, though, the enhanced individuals in this case may still perform less well than other highly talented, non-enhanced individuals. There's no doubt the bar has been raised. But is this substantially different from the way in which the bar is raised by good nutrition and hygiene, or by superior educational opportunities? It's obvious that this second enhancement category is pushing the natural barriers more obviously than the first, and it has moved some distance from any health imperative. It certainly has hypothetical and futuristic overtones. Yet so many of the important issues are of this variety. And then for my third category, it refers to what I'm calling radical transformation, the type of transformation that's advocated by transhumanists. Unfortunately, I think in so much discussion, this more extreme variety of enhancement is often equated with all forms of enhancement, and that's the point that I'm trying to make and to get away from. To quote Wesley Smith, as you've got here, transhumanism generally refers to the emerging social movement that promotes the technological enhancement of human capacities towards the end of creating a utopian era in which post-humans will enjoy absolute morphological freedom and live for thousands of years. These individuals would be then radically transformed against those who are not transformed, or the NTs. And of course, once you get into this way of thinking, the possibilities appear to be endless, at least in the imaginations of the writers. This is because radical enhancement has no boundaries. And not surprising, of course, once finitude and mortality have been overcome. But once into this realm, medicine can then be used to deconstruct and reconstruct the human body. Post-humans may have, we are told, indefinite health spans, indefinite intellectual faculties, and the capability of controlling everything that they are. And of course, once you get into this utopian world, aging is viewed as a disease to be treated, and of course, if possible, vanquished. Mortality would be replaced by immortality, and human bodies would be capable of being endlessly renewed in an age and disease-free world. Now, I have to say, this is not the sort of enhancement I have in mind in anything that I'm saying. My interest centers on enhancement of the categories 1 and 2 variety, which I think are the realistic ones and the ones which are around us now. I want to look a bit at cognitive enhancement, and then I'll say something about sporting enhancement a bit later on. Now, when I use the term cognitive enhancement, I'm using the term to refer to enhancement of cognitive aspects of the brain, things like reasoning, perception, memory, judgment, etc. In other words, it's augmenting some aspect of human intellect, and it would provide people perhaps with better comprehension of complex situations and enable them to come up with speedier and better solutions. And of course, this is where psychoactive drugs come into their own. With the debate surrounding when the use of psychoactive drugs may be considered therapeutic, and when, in the words of the President's Bioethics Council a few years ago, when they take us beyond therapy. Skip over these next two. And I want to pick up now about drugs influencing memory. The point that I'm making here is that so many of these drugs are proving useful. They were developed for older age groups and where there are cognitive problems. But of course they're now proving useful in younger age groups, where improvement in test scores at school or university provides the driving force. And so this brings us face to face with the fears of the affluent worried well, aided and abetted, of course, by commercial pressures within the pharmaceutical industry. It also highlights the way in which society's values and desires can shape the direction and interpretation of scientific endeavor. And then again, there are the drugs that are used to treat ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I'm not going into that itself, but these are neurocognitive enhancers, and they can be used to improve normal mental functioning, such as problem-solving abilities. But of course, once we get into this realm, we have to start questioning what it means to be a person, what it means to be healthy and whole, and to do meaningful work, or to value human life in all its imperfection. Now, I think these are pressing issues because neurocognitive enhancers are widely employed for non-medical reasons. Provigyl and Ritalin are used by those not suffering from narcolepsy and ADHD. That, of course, they're normally used to treat. but they are used to aid concentration or alertness, focus, short-term memory, wakefulness, etc. Most studies testing the use of Ritalin and Provigil in healthy volunteers have shown significant improvements in various aspects of cognitive function. Another drug, donepezil, which was developed as a treatment for Alzheimer's disease, has been shown to improve recall of training when taken by healthy but older pilots in a flight simulator. Here then is another use, totally unrelated to the reason for its development in the first place. Now, of course, life and pharmacology is never this simple, and these drugs have side effects of varying severity and concern. For instance, long-term use of psychopharmaceuticals could permanently alter the brain by inhibiting the role of normal sleep to maintain neuroplasticity and to consolidate new memories. And so, with memories in mind, let's just say a few things about traumatic memories. This introduces us to quite a different scenario, and that is those drugs that may be used to block the formation of traumatic memories, or even to erase them once they've been established. These non-conscious pathological memories can arise from trauma. Main sort of examples one generally thinks of are things like combat, rape, or natural disasters, and of course can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. As we know, a debilitating mental illness caused by a heightened fear response. Now, in this condition, the emotional intensity of the memory is debilitating and is indeed pathological. And the effects that people notice and get are anxiety, nightmares, avoidance, detachment, and suicide. Now, conventional treatments focus on psychotherapy and antidepressants, and they often take some time to work, if they work at all. But beta blockers, such as propranolol, could be administered shortly before or after the trauma. The problem is that in this case, you can use beta blockers, such as propranolol, and they can prevent the embedding of the memories or any fearful events, or they can be used actually to erase them. So there clearly is a role for using these beta blockers in this situation. But there are possible side effects and concurrent erasure of beneficial emotional memories, blunting of the normal desirable fear response, and alteration of moral judgment. So one has to be very careful when using this particular drug in even this situation. The interesting thing, though, and this is where the enhancement comes into it, is that theoretically we can use these drugs on people who are not in that situation and simply use it on what we might consider to be healthy people to erase unpleasant memories, but memories generally considered an integral part of human life. And so the challenge then is, by using these sorts of drugs in this sort of situation, which one would consider to be enhancement, is this having a major impact on actually how people are functioning as human beings? After all, memory is an important aspect, an essential aspect of what we all are. And also, learning from memories, learning from unpleasant memories, things that have gone wrong, are important. If one erases all that, we get into considerable difficulty. And again, some people are very concerned that by using too much propranolol, you could end up then with having considerable negative repercussions on human functioning and brain functioning. However, having said that, that drug is used very considerably in totally other situations, and that doesn't seem to be an end result. Okay, now, what then do we make of all this? Now, there are some... Just go back a moment. Yeah. So, what do we make of these sorts of enhancements? You see, some people will argue that we should be free to use whatever enhancements become available. After all, given a choice, we choose the good life. Given a choice, we will choose good education. We will choose good nutrition. We will choose to go on exciting holidays, or whatever it might be. Is there any difference with using these enhancements? Enhancements, they will argue, provide an opportunity to improve well-being as we use other things to give us the good life. The opposite stance, so that's the positive stance, the negative stance is the opposite. It's the precautionary stance. The opposite stance is the far more cautious one, and as I say, it's precautionary. They'll argue that we don't know enough about enhancements in the brain, and therefore we're unable to predict the negative effects that enhancements may have on individuals and or on society. These may well justify placing restrictions on the freedom of individuals to access them. And so in the light then of these contradictory responses, we need, I think, to dig deeper to ascertain what are the particular enhancement procedures that these may involve. So you've got the two extremes there. And I want to go around just to look then at some of the issues that are raised when we are discussing enhancement. And the first one is cheating. The concern here is that enhancement bypasses the normal practices of an activity. And so, for instance, in sport, these practices amount to learning to train hard and persevere against adversity. And so when doping enters the picture, it becomes possible to bypass these, at least to some extent. Now, if one assumes that doping is against the rules of the sport, that of course is cheating in the sense with which we're all familiar. One athlete has an advantage that other athletes don't have because they complied with the rules. So the playing field is not level when cheating occurs. And so cheating can also be objected to because it corrupts the system, a system that supports normal practices like hard work and discipline. And of course the same applies in the case of cognitive enhancements, except that it's intellectual exertion instead of physical. Now, the trouble here is we all have different natural abilities, whether it be sporting abilities or a very good memory. And it seems implausible to claim that such people are cheating when they exercise these natural abilities, simply because they need to strive less in order to achieve the same level as the less able. Neither are the less able more virtuous because they have to strive more. So I'm far from convinced that enhancement is inherently cheating. A second consideration: enhancement creates inauthentic character traits. What this is saying is that attributes or qualities acquired through enhancements are morally problematic in a way that those same attributes or qualities acquired through normal means aren't. And some fear that direct manipulation of the human body and brain may artificially separate the individual from his or her authentic self. Consider the transforming effect of cosmetic psychopharmacology upon fairly healthy people who, let us say, under medication, such as Prozac, become more outgoing, balanced, and vivacious. Now, Kramer, a good number of years ago, in discussing some of the patients he treated with Prozac, he described the discomforting way that Prozac redefined their understanding of their authentic self. With Prozac, a patient might say, "I never really felt like myself until now." And when the dose is reduced and they return to their previous state, the patient will complain, "I'm not myself." So who is the real authentic self? The one with Prozac or the one without it? And of course, what do we mean by the authentic self? My own intuitive response is to say that it's better that someone is content with life without taking Prozac rather than because of it. But it may be hazardous to conclude that such a person using Prozac in this way is pursuing an inauthentic existence. What one does have to take very seriously is that approaches like Prozac may have side effects, and it's these negative consequences that may tip the balance against their use under some circumstances. A more radical philosophical objection concerns the fear that enhancement technologies will irreversibly change what it means to be human. Now, on one reading of this argument, there are certain core traits that are fundamental to human life, and therefore are inviolable. Of course, it's unclear what these core characteristics may be. Do they include personality, normal aging, gender, intelligence, memory? It's far from self-evident that altering one's core characteristics is wrong or estranges us from our humanness. After all, we currently use many means to enhance ourselves, and we consider these to be morally unproblematic. Everything perhaps from colouring one's hair, using cosmetics, to imbibing caffeine. Now, you might say they're at a different level from what I'm describing, and that's true. But I think we've just got to be very careful as to this particular argument. But what about the fairness of using? What about the fairness of using enhancements? There's no doubt they may bestow an advantage on the enhanced individual, and at times be against the interests of those who are not enhanced. This, of course, is a milder objection to that of cheating. But many things in life are inequitably distributed, and so we have to ask whether the lack of fairness in this instance is any worse than it is in many others that we tolerate. Natural abilities are inequitably distributed, as we all know, and perhaps enhancements could be distributed with preference given to those with less ability, bringing society up to some acceptable and equitable standard. Now, in view of these considerations, I have to say that personally I'm left agnostic on enhancement in general. I don't find sufficient reasons to object to either categories 1 or 2 as a general principle. Each instance of enhancement has to be assessed on its own merits. What will it achieve? Who will benefit? And possibly who will be disadvantaged? Will it result in either short or long-term damage to the individual or society? Can it be justified when assessed alongside other needs within society? Now, these are the type of ethical considerations that crop up in every sphere of life. And they suggest that enhancement issues are not as special as sometimes suggested. However, what I want to do now, just for a very few minutes, is to delve into the complexities of enhancement in sport and ask, does the same apply here? So let's turn then just to some issues in sport. When we think of enhancement in sport, our thoughts immediately go to doping. But it's a phenomenon that's been around in sport since it became a social phenomenon as early as the 3rd century BC. And there have been tragic consequences of doping throughout that whole period. So it's been well known, it may not have been handled very well, but it's hardly a new phenomenon. Now, in the eyes of the International Olympic Committee, the fundamental principles that justify the fight against doping are, first of all, protection of athletes' health, defense of medical and sports ethics, and at least in principle, the provision of equal opportunities for all in competition. I think it can be tempted to equate doping with enhancement in sport. And it's true that illegal doping is perhaps a paradigm example of cheating through enhancement, and that doping and enhancement occupy very similar and often overlapping territory. But a good deal of interest in enhancement in the sporting arena has been directed at approaches that have nothing to do with enhancement through the taking of drugs. And so, just give you perhaps the really major example. I'm not going to go into any details here at all. And this is adjusting red blood cell level. Now, red blood cells contain hemoglobin, which transports oxygen to body tissues. Red blood cell level has a positive effect on sporting performance, particularly in endurance events. And therefore, it's advantageous for athletes to increase their red blood cell level, although a level over 50% carries increased risks of problems associated with polycythemia and then a strain on the heart from increased blood viscosity. So you could have heart failure, and that, of course, is one of the really negative health effects of it. This is only the beginning, though. The challenge arises from the different ways in which red blood cell levels can be increased. All these involve the hormone erythropoietin, which controls red blood cell protection. The major current ways of doing this are the ones you've got here, and I'm not going to go into them. What I want to say, though, is that of these methods, only 3 of them are banned by the World Anti-Doping Agency. And they are the first 2 and the last one, which I should have put in red. Blood doping, synthetic erythropoietin injection, and gene doping. They're the ones currently banned, even though the effects are the same in all cases. Now, this may be a quite reasonable, pragmatic position for them to take, but it doesn't get over the problem of inherent unfairness. Now, there may be no way around this, since, of course, none of us is born equal, and our upbringings and circumstances add to what you might call genetic unfairness, and in some of these cases, environmental unfairness. Just the one other example I want to mention is this very famous one of Oscar Pistorius. To me, this is one of the most fascinating case studies in the sporting enhancement arena. A South African sprinter, Oscar Pistorius. He's known as the Blade Runner, or if you like, the fastest man on no legs. He is the double amputee world record holder in the 100, 200 and 400 meters for that class of athlete. He was born without a fibula in each of his legs, and at the age of 11 months, his legs were amputated halfway between the knees and ankles. So he runs with the aid of these incredibly efficient artificial limbs, which, as you can see, are the Cheetah Flexfoot carbon fiber transtibial artificial limbs. Of course, this raises fascinating issues here. The fundamental question is whether prostheses like these provide the competitor with an unfair advantage. Are his prostheses an enhancement, or are they a therapeutic device that enables him to live a relatively normal existence? Now, I think if we were outside the sporting arena, we'd have to agree that they are therapeutic. Of course, they enhance his performance compared to what it would have been like with abnormal limbs, let alone amputations. But he is starting off from a grossly subnormal base. The interesting question, of course, is whether it would be any different if someone with normal legs had them amputated in order to fit these particular prostheses. If there was evidence, that is, they would enhance running ability beyond that achievable without them. Were that to occur, we would, it seems to me, be dealing quite emphatically with an example of enhancement. And this would most definitely fall within the legitimate purview of the sporting authorities. But that's not where he is at. And the Olympic committees had great difficulty in sorting him out and have changed their mind. I'll go over that one. Okay, let's pull together some of these threads. The problem lies in determining a coherent distinction between activities and treatments that ought to be permissible in sport and those that ought not. And this resembles the ongoing debate about the therapy enhancement distinction in medicine. There's no consensus about whether there is a clear distinction between activities that are unequivocally enhancing and those that are therapeutic, with no enhancement intended. And I think this lack of clarity between the two is, I think, debilitating when confronted by some of these enhancement decisions in sport. Are the use of these prosthetic blade legs by amputee athlete runners therapeutic or enhancement? The other fascinating issue here is that therapeutic exemptions to banned performance enhancements are allowed by the World Anti-Doping Agency, although the criteria used to decide these appear to presuppose that enhancement and impairment to health can be distinguished, in each case considered by the committee. And so the committee decides these on a case-by-case basis. But some general examples include the use of normally prohibited beta-2 agonists to treat acute asthma, and insulin injections to treat insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus. So the use of these prohibited substances is permitted in these exceptional cases, only insofar as they restore the athlete to normal health. Another concept, of course, that can be difficult to define. These cases may give the impression of being intuitively straightforward, but that they are, of course, far from that. And then, into this morass, can I introduce Hans Liessen? He's a sports physician, and he has used the therapy enhancement distinction to argue in favour of broadening the conception of therapeutic doping in sport. He claims that elite sports athletes are, and I quote, now at the limit of human performance, where extreme physiological events occur. The body of a high-performance athlete is no longer comparable to that of a normal person. As a result, he claims that much currently illegal doping is therapeutically necessary to support recovery and reduce illness under the extremely physiologically demanding conditions of elite sport. And so Liessen then challenges the idea that there are absolute states of illness, health, normality, therapy, and enhancement. In his view, these concepts are relative. Now, okay, that's a slightly extreme and perhaps debatable view, but I think is one worth considering. Let's look at the status of athletes in another way. This is that most athletes would probably qualify as enhanced using routine medical criteria. Through training, diet, and perfectly legal medicines, athletes aim for, and in many cases achieve, physical states well beyond that which is required for good health or normal functioning. In other words, the distinction isn't between therapy and enhancement, but between degrees or methods of enhancement, some of which are allowed and some of which are not allowed. Okay, well, trying to put all this together then. Should we be worried about enhancement procedures, the sort that I've been talking about? I'd like to give you a definitive answer. I don't think I can. As one thinks around the examples that I provided you with, we come back to the quest for improving what we are and what we would like to be or to achieve. In discussing procedures that may be thought of as enhancement, it will become evident, I think, that we are constantly walking this tightrope between what is normal and what is improvement. I haven't, of course, gone into this boundary, but the underlying thrust of all I've said is that the boundary is a fluid and a debatable one. And it's often unclear exactly why some improvements seem to worry us and others don't. As I've said on a couple of occasions, our expectations today in Western-style countries bear little resemblance to what they would have been 150 or so years ago. In very real terms, we are all enhanced. Now, we might not use that term, we might not like it. We could certainly say we are improved compared with our forebears. And simply because of public health measures, vaccination, and nutritional status. All of these provide us with freedoms to extend ourselves in ways unavailable to most people in those earlier societies. And of course, what applies to us today most certainly doesn't apply to far too many people in the majority world of the 21st century. And I think that's another illustration of lack of fairness, and it has myriad moral concerns. And so then, I think we end up with just a number of very general considerations, and I'm just going to leave these very open-ended. Are we to strive to improve ourselves? What's wrong with improving ourselves? Don't we do it all the time? Or hope that we can do it? Hasn't this generally considered to be a good, whether it's about education or social circumstances, housing, opportunities of all description, use of medicines, use of biomedical technologies, whatever? Perhaps the major issue is actually to distinguish enhancement from improvement, and if that distinction exists, rather, I think, than enhancement from therapy. Of course, both distinctions might be equally debatable, but I think the enhancement and the therapy distinction is really not going to get us very far. Okay, there are then very far-reaching implications, which I haven't gone into, but I just put down here as something I think that we need to contemplate as we look at this area, even as we look at it in terms of the more restricted sort of enhancement that I've talked about. I think it does have theological as well as ethical and social connotations. Because in the end, we're always questioning core aspects of what our humanity, what it means to be human, what we want from ourselves and from other people, what we want for ourselves and for other people. I think it very much touches on, well, what are the goals of medical care and human aspirations? Do we simply go on and on? Are there limits to what we're trying to do? And while we don't generally think of those in terms of enhancement, I think they are actually closely tied in. And of course, also it touches on the whole dimensions of control over our humanness, of what makes us the sort of people we are, and how much, of course, we are dependent upon external factors like the sort of medical and other technology around us. Now, I've tried to emphasize the realistic present-day enhancements that are all around us, rather than the highly speculative ones that will enable us all to live to 600 years of age if we really want that. I think we need to come to terms with the present-day ones before we embark too much on the idealistic and probably quite unrealistic future ones. And I think with that, I'll stop.
Well, thank you, Gareth. I certainly resonate with that idea that our bodies are not the same as those of elite athletes, speaking personally. That leaves us lots of time for questions. So, yeah, Geoffrey.
I wonder if I could invite you to say something specifically about cosmetic surgery.
Yes?
I didn't think you really touched
No,
on
I didn't touch on
it.
that.
In many ways, it could be regarded as a therapy or just an enhancement. I'd be interested to know your views on it.
Again, like all this, it depends what you mean by cosmetic surgery. I mean, if you are looking, and again, the distinction between that and plastic surgery, and again, obviously, they are going to overlap. I mean, if someone, let us say, has had dreadful burns to their face, then plastic surgery is carried out. Now, okay, you can say that that is an injury, something that has happened to them. They started off with perfectly straightforward facial features, now they haven't got it. So that's clear therapy. Then you can go to the next point and say, well, let's say that someone was born with major congenital abnormality on their face. What are they? Now, I mean, I think most of us, most of the time, will say, of course we do what we can to help them, because it helps them, not just their appearance, but it helps them psychologically, their view of themselves, their relationship to the world around them and to other people. So, probably most of that is uncontroversial. Then, of course, you get into the other area of some aspects of cosmetic surgery, where really, I want to look 30 years younger, not me, and, I have cosmetic surgery every couple of years or something. Well, I mean, on the one hand, probably I personally would just laugh and say, isn't this a bit silly? Can one say, I mean, apart from the money they're spending, etc., I suppose the thing is, what does it tell us, what does it tell them about their view of life and their view within the human community? And I suppose one would say, well, look, if they are so ephemeral, so dependent just on their appearance, isn't that sad? Now, if one can then go on and say, well, one shouldn't do it, I don't think I could possibly go that far. So I think, like everything else, you go from the hugely serious part where you can see it is obviously therapy, although there may be an enhancement aspect to it, to the other area where you can see it's largely enhancement, but there may be the slightest therapeutic area touch to it. So I think you're somewhere in between those extremes, and you'll always have this continuum. I mean, whether or not, if I was that sort of doctor, I would want to devote my life to doing, if you like, pure cosmetic surgery as opposed to plastic surgery. I think that would tell you a lot about me.
Yeah.
Thank you. I was interested in the use of beta blockers to reduce fearfulness. And it reminded me of an amazing life cycle of some parasite that affects mice and changes their fearfulness of cats so they're more likely to get caught, which enables the parasite to complete its life cycle through the cat. But it did make me think on about a potential ethical question. If instead of the beta blocker situation, you actually had a drug which could enhance caution, would it be right to give this to young male drivers to save hundreds and hundreds of lives? And it's just a thought that only occurred to me after you mentioning beta blockers. Because, it is a lack of caution that causes so many male novice driver fatalities.
I'd never thought of that. I mean, I agree with what you're saying. I've never actually thought of that, yes. The lack of caution, the great aggrandizement, I'm never going to die sort of feeling that you get, obviously, particularly with young males, I suppose is implicit within young males. I think perhaps one would hope that in educational terms they would be got out of that, but obviously you're going to get the problem. What I think that then comes down to the area is that if you have someone who is transgressing the law, creating real problems, would that be a legitimate form of therapy? That's one thing. And the second thing which would go with that is, to what extent what you are doing, is it temporary or is it permanent? And I think if you could do something which would be of benefit for 2 or 3 years through that stage, I think you could see possibly it could be legitimate. If on the other hand you're going to do something which would affect them for the rest of their lives, I think you are getting into quite different territory.
That's a fantastic talk, and I'm glad I got here. But you mentioned theology with really getting into it, and I think at this moment, in this context, can I sort of mention DMT, dimethyltryptamine, which is the active ingredient of the ayahuasca ceremony of South America, and in North America, United States, the Supreme Court voted 8-0 to legalise it for religious purposes, to allegedly bring one into an imminent experience of God. And yet in this country it's treated as a Class A drug. Is this not symptomatic of this bureaucracy that it seems to have taken over and dominate, prevent genuine research in an establishment such as this?
I don't know too much about this, so I better be careful. I can see what you're saying. I don't think I want to get into the legalize or not legalize something for that reason. I think when you are looking at religious experiences, we know that there are a whole lot of ways in which people can have religious experiences. Either for whatever reason, including psychologically, etc., and include, of course, the use of various drugs. It will all come down then to how important one thinks the religious experiences per se are, or whether they are secondary effects to something perhaps more fundamental, if you like, in their relationship with God and the ways in which that works out in practice. So I'm not answering your question. I'm not sure that I'd too much want to, because as I say, I'm getting into territory I don't know too much about. But as I say, there are numerous ways in which one can alter people's brains in various pharmacological ways to give them increased or decreased, or certainly increased experiences or religious experiences. Now, it is also evident that some people are more amenable to some of these experiences than others, and certainly they are more amenable to drug regimes than others. Now, whether what this does or doesn't tell us about anything fundamental about religion or a particular religion worldview, I think is different.
Yeah. Professor, a student taking their exams, an athlete on the starting line, will often pray. To what extent is prayer an enhancement?
Depends if it works or not. Yeah, I'm always fascinated by that. Let us say you have 3 Christians who are running in a race. Are they each going to pray that they're going to win? If they're praying, they'll do their best. I have no problem with that. Life are inequitably distributed. Important that what they do, what we do, I mean, everything that we are, should be within a context of our belief system, our worldview, our relationship to God, if we have a relationship to God. And I think within that context, we should always be doing our best to perform as well as we possibly can, and also, though, to act towards others in ways that are best, and in ways that will serve them as well. Is prayer an enhancement? Well, as I say, it depends if it has any positive effect. Sorry.
Yeah, on the question of prayer, you might say that prayer is actually asking God to help you do His will. So if you pray that you show glory to God, I guess that's what you should be praying, not that you should win or lose.
It wasn't perhaps as swift as it might have first appeared, because, I mean, has there not been some research that actually prayer, the act of prayer or meditation, actually neurologically is beneficial for a person?
There are plenty of studies in these areas, and again, I haven't studied them in any sort of detail. It does interest me that quite a lot of the studies on the influence of prayer in medical conditions, I'm not quite sure how avidly I go in that direction. I'm not for one moment suggesting that it doesn't have an influence. But I sometimes wonder, and this perhaps is me just being a cynic, if you've got someone who's had a heart attack or whatever, then you have all this study set up about praying for them and others praying for them and all that sort of thing after the heart attack. I'm afraid for the cynic in me says, well, perhaps they'd live a different lifestyle. They wouldn't have had the heart attack in the first place. Now, I mean, that's being a cynic, and I'm not being 100% serious about that. But there are elements of that to it. But I think in the end that prayer is really something about our relationship with God through Christ. And it's not something which is just there as like a drug which is going to make us better. I mean, I think if we use it in that way, then I think we're getting onto some really difficult territory.
You mentioned about futuristic approaches, and one area you didn't mention is what's called cognitive augmentation. So, for example, I work with brain-computer interfaces, and obviously there are other things that people have. The modern American soldier has lots of augmenting technology, and older adults can have that as well. I mean, to what extent is somebody with a permanent brain-computer interface, for example, somehow less human? And where do you draw the line between human and inhuman?
I'm not sure that they, of necessity, are any less human, if at all. I mean, I would think, for instance, if, let us say, I had a cochlear implant, I wouldn't see that I was any less human because of that. Now, of course, that's only to affect one very specific part of my functioning. If, let us say, I had, say, Parkinson's disease, and then again I had a particular implant, a part of my motor system, I wouldn't see that that was making me less human, any more than people who walk around with artificial hips and knees, and there are plenty of those around, are any less human.
Okay, but what about artificial neural networks?
What I think it then comes to is what parts of their brain and functioning are being affected. I think if there was something which was affecting my decision-making capacity, my will, my expectations, my view of the world, I don't know if it would make me less human, but it would have considerable implications for my humanity. If, on the other hand, it's not doing core things like that, then I don't get too worried about them. But I do think it depends which networks you are talking about.
A lot is used for decision making, so the American soldier is actually calling on resources to actually make decisions for him.
If I felt that those decisions were then outside the control of those people, I would be concerned. And I think you've probably then got to come around and say, well, are we exploiting those soldiers to any extent by doing these sorts of things? Now, that's another question, I know, but I would see that as a very important ethical question.
Well, I think on that note, we do try to finish at 2 o'clock sharp so that people can get away. I'm sure you'll be here for a few minutes more if people want to talk informally. So before we thank Professor Jones again, let me just remind you the next talk is in exactly 2 weeks' time here, on the 18th of May. It will be by Michael Murray, coming from the USA, to talk about animal suffering, theological and philosophical perspectives on that. So you're most welcome then, with lunch again half an hour before that. So let's thank Gareth Jones.